What is up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and, well, probably the biggest album to come out this year has arrived. After over 6.5 years of waiting since their previous album, and a lot has changed in those 6.5 years for this band, but we're finally going to get to review the latest offering from one of my all-time favorite bands, Megadeth, the sick, the dying, and the dead. So yes, finally a new Megadeth album after years of waiting, wondering what the fuck was going to happen because, well, the last album we got, Dystopia, which came out in the first part of 2016, and for me, and I talked about in my Megadeth album ranking, it was a good album, but not like mind-blowingly awesome to me. I thought Metallica's Hardwired was much better than Dystopia. I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for that, but that's just how I felt. But since that album came out, a lot has changed in the Megadeth world. First, Dave Mustaine went through throat cancer, fought it to now he's in remission, and surprisingly still sounds tolerable vocal-wise, even now that he's almost 61 years old now. It's crazy to think that he's still kicking ass to this day. And then, of course, you know, the pandemic and all that caused even more issues. But the big one was last year, the whole David Ellefson scandal, which to me was just fucking dumb, and I'm glad David's moved on from that, so not holding any ill will towards David Ellefson, but yeah, kind of dumb. But even it was reported that that Ellefson and Mustaine was already having some problems even before that, so it happened the way it happened. And then, of course, the other big wild cards was who was going to be the drummer, since you had Chris Adler on drums during Dystopia, but they would end up picking up a awesome drummer, formerly from Soilwork, and I believe did some stuff with Aborted, Dirk Verburen, who is one hell of a drummer, and he was definitely like the big wild card for this whole album, even before Ellefson was dismissed from the band. But then after Ellefson's dismissal, it was like, okay, are they going to keep Ellefson's tracks, or are they going to be redone by a different bassist? And while live, and still live today, the return of James Lomenzo, who played on United Abominations and my favorite of the modern era, Endgame, he didn't do the bass parts on this album, though he's been touring with the band again, and, well, I'll talk more about that towards the end. But for the album, they would pick up one of the top 5 greatest bass players of all time, currently in Testament, Steve DiGiorgio, who was an excellent choice to come in to do the bass on this album. So pretty much we got a supergroup here on this album: Mustaine, Kiko, Dirk, and DiGiorgio. That's a stacked lineup for a Megadeth release. But now, how does the album fare itself? Well, let's find out. So we kick things off with the title track. Has this cool, like, clean guitar intro to set kind of a dark mood, before suddenly, it's time to blow doors down, with some trade-off melodies and some sick riffing. First 2 verses speed things up a little bit to showcase aggression, and also quick lead lines come in throughout, and you're going to hear me say that quite a bit throughout this video. But afterwards, things then turn dramatic and sinister with acoustic guitars and ambience before the speed returns, and then we get into some real thrash with the riffs and the beats, and they show up to build towards a lead section that showcases pretty much everything that this album's going to offer you lead work-wise: feel, melody, and shred. Then we get into Life in Hell, which right away, thrash fury, it's a vicious riff to just punch you right in the face. Verses pretty much keep that riff and energy going, and even a really killer drum fill from Dirk. The choruses here on this track are short, sweet, and to the point with a punch. Shredding lead comes in after chorus 1 to just basically say, hey, why don't we just let loose here? And even after the second chorus, you get into this really cool groove that kind of felt like something from Black Sabbath or Celtic Frost or even Danzig a little bit. It was a really cool groove while Dave is dropping some spoken word darkness onto your ear holes. Night Stalkers. Now here we get into back-to-back the longest tracks of the album. First, the longest track at a little over 6.5 minutes, Night Stalkers, which was one of the big singles of the album. More viciousness unleashed on the guitars and into the verses, and the verses pretty much keep this riff going. And at the end of the first verse, shredding lead right into your ears, and then the choruses have this like cool kind of like speed chug, and it was very direct. And then in the middle of the track, we get the big guest star, Ice-T, who I love from Law & Order SVU, and of course his band Body Count, comes in to drop some vengeful messages before we get into the bridge, where it just gets down and dirty with the breakdowns. Then the lead section we get here has taps, shred, and melody going on, which is really, really unique to here. So not a whole lot of feel, but just more to showcase how good Kiko and Dave are on the guitar. Suddenly, after the third chorus, things turn somber with acoustic guitars and strings popping up to add some atmosphere, and then out of nowhere, the mood shifts and a killer bass line from Steve comes in, followed by a sweet riff, and then back into the thrash to conclude before we get into the final lead that showcases more feeling. Then we get to the other long track, a little over 6 minutes, Dogs of Chernobyl, and after some like dark chimes, and we get into some beautiful yet dramatic acoustic guitars to set an eerie atmosphere with Russian spoken word and electric guitar build-up moments. And after that mood is set, into a heavy groove pretty much throughout the verses and the choruses. The riffs change along quite well with melodic progressions that eventually lead to more of those quick-fire melodic leads or shredding leads, depending on the song. And after chorus number 2, some thrashy aggression is brought forth and comes along with another killer bass line, riffs, the beats. And then the bridge has some cool trade-offs between the quick-fire leads and Dave's spoken word parts to kind of like change up things a little bit, almost like in a prog sense. And then the final spoken word part has a sweet breakdown and drum fill to bring the song to a close. Then we get into Sacrifice right away with some classic Megadeth riffing, sweet lead lines throughout the verses. The choruses help to make the riffing feel a little bit more upbeat, like the choruses kind of had a bit more of almost like an upbeat feel, which was kind of strange. And after the first verse, the mood shifts briefly to build up to the following verses and moments that have I cannot fucking speak. It built into a riff that has like a slightly chromatic approach, but instead of going up on the fretboard, they're going down, going higher in scale. After some more of the classic Megadeth guitars, into another fantastic shredding lead, and the song builds up a little bit towards the end, and you get some like cool tribal beats, which was something I had not heard in a Megadeth song probably ever, at least to my recollection. And then the final lead here mixes feeling, shred, and melody, pretty much. I might as well just not talk about the leads, because pretty much all of the leads on this album pretty much mix shred, feel, and melody together and do it so well. Like, the leads definitely were stepped up a notch on this album compared to Dystopia. Then we get into Junkie. Right away we get what the chorus is going to be all about. The verses and the pre-choruses get back into some gritty riffs. And while we get to the choruses themselves, has an almost Iron Maiden vibe going on, because the guitars get a little bit more melodic in the choruses. And we do get like a really cool melodic lead, heading into the breakdown, which was a really cool breakdown. And then for the first time on the album, we get lead trade-offs going on between Dave and Kiko, which was a real highlight for me on this entire album. Psychopathy or Psychopathy, however you want to pronounce it. Shortest song of the album, minute 20 seconds, but it was like this battle atmospheric track with some sweet drums by Dirk and the guitars to help accentuate those vibes of battle. And Dave's spoken word comes back, and while some people might look at this as a pointless track, I actually want to hear this live. I think that would be pretty cool to hear. And it builds into the following track, Killing Time, which right into the verses we get into some thrashy chugs, and then the choruses brings in melody and almost a bit of a Judas Priest vibe. And there are a couple times towards the end of the album where it felt a little bit like Megadeth paying homage to Judas Priest. Then acoustic guitars return to bring the mood down, while the drums are just going everywhere with excellent tom work and cymbal accents. And it all builds towards a somber lead at first, then it turns more upbeat and showcasing a little bit of shred while maintaining feel. And then the final lead of this song definitely showcasing a little bit more atmosphere to match the eerie nature that this track is projecting. Soldier On, the next track, wicked galloping groove right out of the gate with more classic Megadeth riffs, but still kind of having a little bit of an Iron Maiden vibe. And that vibe continues even through the choruses as you get some like tapping melodies on the guitars. And then one of the big moments I was waiting for this whole album, because you have Dirk on drums who has his own blast beat, we finally get the Dirk blast. And it happens a couple of times on this track, and my eyes perked up for a moment. I'm like, oh shit, we got a blast beat on a Megadeth album. That's pretty fucking sweet. And then the bridge, call me crazy on here, but the beginning of the bridge has this almost like Lamb of God vibe going on with the tapping section. It almost felt like the beginning of Again We Rise off of Sacrament. Kind of reminded me of that a little bit. While the drums and bass really build things up quite well into another crazy lead section that just delivers everything that this album has to offer in terms of guitar leads. Then suddenly a huge dynamic shift happens where it goes quiet and then boom into the final chorus, and then we get a little funny military march, which I thought was pretty entertaining. Now I'm going to have to remember how to pronounce this next track. Célébrante, there we go, Célébrante, which is a term for celebrity in a fashionable society and all this stuff. Pretty much this song was almost like a call out to Hollywood, pretty much lyrically. The beginning of the track has these weird, like, psychedelic clean guitars, which was a bit of a weird moment for me. But then it gets down and dirty into some, like, speed metal D beats and riffs, and they continue pretty much throughout most of the song through the verses and even the choruses, while at the same time, with the choruses staying in that D beat, it felt like a call out to Hollywood being pricks. So there you go. Another heavy breakdown showing up on the bridge before the mood suddenly shifts to have a little bit more atmosphere and melody. Love how the bass line we get here complements the lead section right here on this track. And then a second lead section shows up that unleashes chaos and more lead trade-offs between Dave and Kiko. Then we get to Mission to Mars, the penultimate track. Cool bass line and guitars to kind of set the mood while you get some like sci-fi atmospherics. And then we get into the verses, which once again has a bit of like a classic metal vibe, like Saxon, Judas Priest again. Then the choruses showcases a little bit of like a softer side to Dave's vocals. I know Dave's vocals is a huge dividing line for Megadeth fans. I don't mind his vocals. They're not terrible like a lot of people say they are. He's a competent vocalist, but not great. I will say that. And I think his voice has aged well for me. Doesn't sound like he's lost his voice even after going through throat cancer. But anyways, and then the bridge and pretty much the remainder of this track has some like cool space radio communications while the guitars are providing atmosphere to complement that. Then suddenly, alternate picking, badass drums, that kind of feel like a mix of Iron Maiden and classic Megadeth. And now we get to the final track of the album and the first single, We'll Be Back, which may be my favorite track of the album, possibly. I'd have to listen to the album more to really choose, but the first single, the final track, We'll Be Back, vicious riffing unleashed and ready to kill. Verses get downright gritty and dirty and heavy. Then the choruses are very vengeful in the mood, while it still is classic Megadeth to the core. Another wild lead section that has shred and taps, and again, more trade-offs between Dave and Kiko, and actually it was Dave doing those taps in the second half of this lead, which was really, really sweet. Cool galloping riff to lead us into yet another lead section, and then the build-up with the guitars and the drums into the breakdown at the end was fucking tasty, and into some more lead work. So, I mean, what more do I have to say about this album in terms of the leads? Like, the leads pretty much all throughout were fantastic. Dave and Kiko showcasing a lot of amazing talent. And the big complaint that I had, one of the big complaints that I had with Dystopia, it didn't feel like Kiko had a whole lot of songwriting input with his guitars and the leads. It felt very much like a Dave album. Here, it felt like Dave may have felt guilty that Kiko didn't get a whole lot of moments of shine on Dystopia, so he thought, you know what, Kiko, let's see what you got. Bring in some of those influences you had from your days on Angra. And I think Kiko's leads on here outshine Dave's, in my opinion, on this album. Even though Dave has some really cool leads on here too, including that second half of the lead, or the first lead in We'll Be Back. But Kiko just unleashes amazing talent throughout this album. So right out of the gate, that actually helped this album big time with Kiko having his moments. And actually, it felt like Dave was feeling very, very generous to have everybody on this album have moments of shine and amazement. Like, DiGiorgio had some moments where you hear his bass lines. I mean, the bass is prevalent throughout the mix. You can hear the bass all throughout. But there were moments on a few tracks where he would get his own bass line and nothing else going on except for maybe drums. And then Dirk, the big wild card, he got to unleash his talent, and we got a Dirk blast on a Megadeth album, which is fucking sweet. And then even Dave's vocals, like I said, I think he did better on this album vocally than on Dystopia. Basically, I'm saying this album blows Dystopia out of the water. Dystopia was good, but nothing spectacular. Here, and then even the production was amazing on here. Like, everything was audible, it was clear, didn't feel like anything weighed on top of the other, it was properly mixed, it was hefty. Yeah, it's cleaner, but that's the modern day of production for big bands, but it works. So overall, to score this, I will go ahead and say it. This is the best Megadeth album since Endgame. I think this is a great album, and also, I'm going to be seeing Megadeth at the end of the month, and they'll probably play a song or two off of this album, but I look forward to seeing what happens at that show. But overall, this album, it's not perfect. There were definitely some moments where it felt like the songs did drag just a little bit, particularly the longer tracks. Felt like they kind of dragged on a little bit too long. Maybe if they would have trimmed the fat on some of that stuff. And then, of course, the other thing, the album did kind of feel a bit formulaic with how during the verses and post-verses and then after the choruses, you would get like quick-fire leads, which nothing wrong with those. Those were great. But I think they just did it too much. So this album's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But overall, and I know I've been going long on this one because, well, there's a lot to talk about on here, and this was the big one for the year. But overall, buy this album. I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. This is fantastic stuff. Best Megadeth album since Endgame. Was it worth the 6.5-year wait? I would say yes. This album blows Dystopia out of the water. Where would it rank overall in Megadeth's discography for me? Hard to judge right now since I need to listen to it more to really make an opinion, but right now it would probably be somewhere in the middle for me. But hey, this is a great album. I'm definitely going to pick this up, probably at the show, so we'll see what happens. But anyways, those are just my thoughts. What are your guys' thoughts on The Sick, the Dying, and the Dead by Megadeth? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, horns high, see you guys later.
At the ballpark. Someone's gonna put lasagna.
I took a tomato.
Okay, yeah, it's Levi. It's Levi.
Damn it.
I'm done. Could I?
I really want to know what he got for this one.
Alright, Seth, let's go to Tomato Town.
Seth is dying.
I would like a single slice of your greatest tomatoes
I
in
would
the
like
park.
your finest tomato, please.
Calm down, Seth. Calm down, Seth. Calm down.
Somebody vote.
No, it's
Levi.
five is the
Levi's the one that has some
Five is
votes.
the majority.
Yeah.
Oh
my lord.
Seth, breathe.
Oh,
Tomato. I would be really interested to see these prompts.
Yeah, like
Officer,
literally.
please escort me out of the ballpark. I just wanted to eat my tomato.